Welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works. You send us interesting source material and we dive deep, extracting the key insights. And today's dive is a fascinating one.
Yeah, we get some really interesting stuff from a listener. It's actually a physician's personal account of healing from, well, I got to say, a pretty remarkable number of chronic illnesses.
Definitely a lot going on. And, for our listeners out there, especially those who are, all about that efficient learning, you're going to love this one. We're going to get into some aha moments about the mind-body connection and the incredible potential for, well, personal transformation.
Big stuff for sure.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to really unpack the core principles behind this physician's self-healing journey. I mean, what did it actually take for them to overcome all these health challenges? And what might that, suggest about our own potential for well-being? And just to give you an idea, we're not talking about just a couple of minor issues here. This physician had a whole laundry list of ailments.
Yeah, at age 50, they were dealing with, well, let's see, we're talking about persistent migraines, blocked digestion tubes, vision problems so bad they needed trifocals, chronic sinusitis and allergies, and a whole bunch of different skin conditions. Oh, and gout, too, like really bad gout attacks, so bad they needed a cane to get around. So we're already talking about a pretty diverse range of problems, right?
And that's just the tip of the iceberg, honestly. It goes on. We're talking cholesterol problems, a chronic duodenal ulcer that had been unresponsive to treatment for, get this, 2 decades, pancreatitis on and off, gastritis with hyperacidity and pylorospasms, which, by the way, led to some seriously restrictive dietary limitations. Then there's recurring colitis, diverticulitis with hemorrhaging so severe that surgery was actually on the table. Oh, and arthritis in the cervical spine, low back syndrome requiring regular chiropractic work, Raynaud's syndrome with concerns about potential gangrene. And then, just to add to the mix, a whole cluster of symptoms labeled as middle-age syndrome, things like always having cold hands and feet, low energy, low libido, and depression. It really paints a picture of a body under a lot of stress, right?
A lot of stress, for sure. And we're still not done. Add to that a pilonidal cyst, chronic bronchitis with a constant cough, super sensitivity to poison ivy like hospitalization level sensitivity, athlete's foot, dandruff, inflammation of the cartilage in the chest, that's Theisel's syndrome for those keeping track, serious dental and gum problems with bone loss to the point where surgery was recommended. And to top it all off, kinesiological testing indicated a general energy imbalance, suggesting that, things were out of whack on a pretty fundamental level.
Yeah, it wasn't just isolated issues. It was like a whole body system kind of thing.
Definitely systemic.
And of course, all of this was taking a huge toll on their life. They had to follow an incredibly restricted diet, lost a significant amount of weight, actually. They were quite underweight, and their friends were, really worried about them, even saying they didn't think they'd live much longer. So this context really drives home how severe and just how all-encompassing these conditions were. It kind of makes you wonder, right? How could someone who was on the surface, successful, educated, seemingly living a balanced life, they even had a strong spiritual practice with, like 2 hours of daily meditation, how could they be suffering so much? Especially when they were trying different therapies and everything.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? It doesn't quite add up at first glance. I mean, they had tried various things like self-hypnosis, macrobiotics, reflexology, and a bunch of other alternative treatments, but nothing seemed to really address the root cause.
Exactly. So what was the missing piece?
Well, the text points to one initial insight, a very strong will.
Okay, so they were determined, driven. How does that tie into their health, though?
Well, it seems that this strong will allowed them to kind of, power through, maintain their professional life, and keep up appearances despite all this constant discomfort. But it seems like this came at a cost. It meant pushing down, suppressing anything that could get in the way of, well, just keeping going. And those things, more often than not, were feelings, emotions.
Interesting. So they were so focused on functioning, on being strong,
Right.
that they weren't allowing themselves to really feel their emotions.
That's the idea. And it's even more interesting when you consider that, the text also highlights the scientific ideal of objectivity, the whole absence of emotion thing. And you can see how that might have kind of reinforced this pattern of suppressing feelings, especially in a clinical environment where they're surrounded by, intense human suffering all the time. It's almost like the skills and mindset that made them a good doctor might have also been contributing to their own health struggles.
That's a fascinating paradox. It's like the very tools they used to help others were somehow working against them internally.
Right. And this need to be objective, to be in control, combined with that strong will, it seems to have created this backlog of, well, unprocessed emotions. like across the board, not just related to work. And the text suggests that this buildup, this internal pressure, is what ultimately manifested as all these different physical ailments.
So it wasn't just the stress of the job, it was the way they were dealing with that stress by suppressing all these feelings.
Precisely.
So to recap, we have a physician dealing with a huge number of chronic illnesses, likely fueled by this, like, chronic suppression of emotions, this belief in objectivity above all else. And it seems like their strong will, while helpful in some ways, was also part of the problem. So what was the turning point? How did they start to shift this pattern?
Well, the turning point came through the exploration and application of two key things: the mechanism of surrender and the principles from A Course in Miracles, specifically the workbook, which really emphasizes contemplation and forgiveness as a way to alleviate guilt. Now, for those who haven't encountered it, A Course in Miracles is a spiritual text that's all about, shifting your perception of reality through forgiveness. It's a big deal in some circles.
Okay, so surrender and forgiveness. How did those two things play into their healing?
Well, first off, it's important to understand that the mechanism of surrender that they're talking about wasn't like, some dramatic external action. It was an internal thing, something they could do silently throughout the day. A real shift in their mindset, in how they're related to their own experiences, their emotions, their thoughts. And this surrendering was happening alongside their engagement with the forgiveness practices in the workbook.
So it was like a two-pronged approach. They were working on letting go of their resistance and also actively practicing forgiveness.
Exactly. And the really interesting thing is that these two practices, working together, seem to unlock what the text describes as Pandora's box. Basically, as they started to release the pressure valve internally, all these suppressed thoughts and feelings, stuff they hadn't even consciously acknowledged at the time, started to bubble up. It was like an emotional decompression process.
Wow. So by surrendering and forgiving, they were actually allowing all this buried emotional stuff to surface.
Right. And through this process, they came to a really crucial realization, a key insight, that every negative feeling, every negative thought was ultimately tied to a sense of guilt. Like deep down, there was this pervasive feeling of guilt driving everything.
So it wasn't just experiencing anger, for example, but also feeling guilty about feeling angry.
Exactly. Even criticizing others, judging them. It was all traced back to this underlying guilt. And the text goes on to say that this constant judgment, both of oneself and others, creates this endless cycle of guilt, fueling more negative emotions, and ultimately manifesting as, well, illness and unhappiness. And the crazy thing is, we're often so used to this guilt that we don't even realize it's there. We just project it outward, creating this need for an enemy, someone or something to blame for our own internal state.
So it's like this subconscious guilt is actually driving a lot of our negative experiences.
That's the idea.
This also explains why the physician was initially so resistant to really acknowledging and processing their feelings. They came from a very logical left-brain perspective, valuing rationality and objectivity above all else. And in that framework, feelings were seen as, the opposite of reason, something to be analyzed and controlled, not something to be fully experienced. And, there's probably some societal conditioning at play there, too, the idea that emotions are somehow less valid or less important than rational thought.
Totally. So feelings, for them, had been more of an intellectual exercise, something to be categorized and filed away, rather than, something to be truly felt and processed.
Okay, so we've got the context now. A physician with a lot of chronic illnesses, fueled by suppressed emotions, a belief in objectivity, and a strong will that was both helping and hindering them. Then comes the turning point with surrender and forgiveness, which leads to this Pandora's box of emotions surfacing. And through it all, they realize this deep connection between guilt and negativity. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What were the actual principles of self-healing that they identified? The text lays out 11 key concepts, right?
Right, and it's really striking how directly these principles address that mind-body connection we've been talking about. Like, the very first principle is, a thought is a thing, it has energy and form. This is not just some fluffy New Age stuff. It's suggesting that thoughts have a real, tangible quality.
So it's not just mental chatter. Our thoughts have actual power, real impact.
Exactly. And the second principle builds on that. The mind, with its thoughts and feelings, controls the body. Therefore, to heal the body, thoughts and feelings need to be changed. This is the foundation of their whole self-healing journey.
It makes sense. If our thoughts and feelings are influencing our physical state, then changing those thoughts and feelings is key to healing.
Right. And the third principle goes even further. What is held in mind tends to express itself through the body. This is where it gets really interesting, right? This idea that our mental and emotional states directly impact our physical well-being. And principle number 4 brings in a crucial distinction. The body is not the real self. It is like a puppet controlled by the mind. This separation, it allows for a bit of detachment from physical symptoms so they don't totally define your sense of self.
So we're not just our bodies, there's this deeper self that's running the show.
That's the idea. And then principle 5 gets into the unconscious aspects of it all. Beliefs that are unconscious can manifest as illness, even though there is no memory of the underlying beliefs. This is about those deep-seated patterns, things we might not even be aware of, that are shaping our reality.
So we might not even remember the beliefs, but they're still impacting us on a physical level.
Exactly. And principle 6 gets even more specific about the emotional roots of illness. An illness tends to result from suppressed and repressed negative emotions, plus a thought that gives it a specific form. This is a two-part formula, right? You have the raw emotional energy and then the thought, the belief, that shapes that energy into a specific physical manifestation.
So it's not just the emotions themselves, but the stories we tell ourselves about those emotions that give them form.
That's it. And principle 7 highlights the importance of addressing the root cause. Thoughts are caused by suppressed and repressed feelings. When a feeling is let go, thousands or even millions of thoughts that were activated by that feeling disappear. So it's about dealing with the feeling itself, not getting caught up in trying to manage all the thoughts that spin off from it.
Deal with the root, and the branches will take care of themselves.
Exactly. And that leads to a really practical strategy outlined in Principle 8. Although a specific belief can be canceled and energy to it can be refused, it is generally a waste of time to try to change thinking itself. So don't try to control your thoughts directly. Focus on shifting the underlying emotional energy.
Because that's where the real power lies.
Right. And then comes the core technique, the heart of the whole thing in Principle 9. We surrender a feeling by allowing it be there without condemning, judging, or resisting it. We simply look at it, observe it, and allow it to be felt without trying to modify it. With the willingness to relinquish a feeling, it will run out in due time. This is the letting go process. It's not about giving up, but about radical acceptance, just letting the feeling be there without trying to change it, fight it, or analyze it.
It's like becoming an observer of your own emotions, right?
Yes. And Principles 10 and 11 offer further guidance on this surrendering process. A strong feeling may recur, which means there is more of it to be recognized and surrendered. And in order to surrender a feeling, sometimes it is necessary to start by relinquishing the feeling that is there about the particular emotion, or e.g. guilt that I shouldn't have this feeling. So it acknowledges that emotions can be layered, and sometimes we have to address our reactions to the emotions themselves.
So it's not just about feeling the anger, but also letting go of the guilt about feeling angry?
Exactly. And the text goes on to explain how to actually put this into practice. It emphasizes allowing feelings to be present without judgment, like watching a cloud pass by, understanding that they're temporary and will eventually fade. And it reminds us that sometimes we need to let go of the feelings we have about our feelings. Things like shame or guilt about feeling sad or angry.
It's almost like we're untangling a knot, layer by layer.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And importantly, it talks about letting go of any payoffs we might be unconsciously getting from holding on to those negative emotions. Like the sense of power we might get from anger, or the sympathy we might receive when we're feeling down.
So sometimes we're actually getting something out of feeling bad, even if we don't realize it.
Yeah, and that can make it harder to let go. But the text makes it clear that there's a difference between these fleeting feelings and our true essential self. It's like feelings are programs that come and go, but our inner essence remains constant. So we don't have to identify with those emotions. It also advises against getting too caught up in our thoughts, because they're often just rationalizations for the feelings underneath.
So feelings first, thoughts second. Got it.
Right. And a crucial element is having this steadfast intention to surrender those negative feelings as they arise. It's a conscious choice, a decision that freedom from negativity is more important than holding on to those familiar, uncomfortable feelings.
Yeah.
It's about actively choosing to surrender, rather than act out those feelings, and even surrendering any resistance to experiencing positive emotions. And it's interesting, the text says to let go of negative feelings, but to share and enjoy positive ones.
Don't hold back the good stuff.
Right. And there's this subtle point that letting go often brings a sense of lightness, a feeling of relief. And counterintuitively, letting go of a desire doesn't necessarily mean it won't happen. In fact, it can actually clear the way for it to manifest, just without all the baggage of attachment.
So it's not about giving up on what you want, but about releasing the need to control it.
Exactly. And the text even touches on the importance of our environment and social connections. It talks about getting it by osmosis, which is the idea that being around people who embody the qualities you want can actually help you cultivate those qualities yourself.
Like surrounding yourself with positive, healthy people can actually rub off on you.
Right. And it also mentions the principle of goes to the value of connecting with people who are also on a path of growth and healing. And it emphasizes that our internal state is always being communicated, even without words.
So we're always influencing the people around us, whether we realize it or not.
That's powerful. And finally, the text underscores the importance of persistence. Healing timelines can vary a lot from person to person, even for different conditions in the same person. So it's about letting go of resistance to the technique itself and committing to practicing it regularly. And there's this powerful statement: you are only subject to what you hold in mind. It really encourages us to stop labeling our physical experiences and focus on the actual sensations instead.
That's so important. Instead of saying, I have asthma, focus on the actual experience. The
Mhm.
tightness in the chest, the wheezing sound.
Right, because those labels are just mental constructs, programs in the mind. The actual experience is just a collection of sensations. And it's the same with emotions. Instead of labeling something as fear, just feel the energy of it without judgment.
Feel it, don't label it.
Exactly. So now that we've laid out these core principles, let's see how they played out in the physician's own healing journey. The text describes a pretty rapid improvement in their lower gastrointestinal issues after they started consistently applying this surrendering technique, and eventually they were able to cancel that surgery that had been scheduled.
That's huge. So just by shifting their mindset, they were able to avoid a major medical procedure.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And over the next few months, a lot of their other chronic symptoms started to improve too. Their migraines became less frequent and less intense, and their chronic back pain eventually disappeared completely. They started to feel lighter and stronger overall.
So the positive effects were starting to ripple outward, impacting different areas of their health.
Right. And then came what they called the acid test, a really bad recurrence of diverticulitis with a lot of bleeding. Instead of rushing to the hospital like they normally would, they decided to fully surrender to the experience. They acknowledged and allowed all the sensations without labeling them or freaking out.
So they just surrendered to the pain and the fear.
Yeah, completely. And this lasted for about 4 hours.
Yeah.
And then, get this, the bleeding stopped, the cramps went away, and the diverticulitis started to heal.
Wow, that's incredible. So even in a really acute, serious situation, this technique worked.
It's a pretty powerful example.
Hmm.
And the text says that as they continued to apply these principles, more of their chronic issues just faded away. And they started to shift from thinking about their health to knowing that their body could heal.
So it became less of a mental process and more of an intuitive knowing, a deep inner certainty.
Right, and this knowing seems to have been a real turning point. The text gives an example of them waking up one morning with this clear knowing that they were cured of their lifelong poison ivy sensitivity. They recognized that the label itself was just a belief, and they let it go. And then they intentionally exposed themselves to poison ivy and had no reaction whatsoever.
They basically cured themselves of a lifelong allergy by changing their belief about it.
That's what it seems like. And there were other instances of this knowing, like a sudden immunity to insecticide fumes, which had always triggered really bad migraines. They walked into a house that had been fumigated, intentionally breathed in the fumes, and had absolutely no reaction. It's like they were proving to themselves that we are only subject to those things that we hold in mind.
So powerful. And what about their cholesterol? That was a big one, right?
Yeah. Well, they started to question that belief about needing to restrict dietary fat. They started eating dairy again, and their cholesterol actually improved. And a bunch of their food intolerances and allergies just vanished. Even the more persistent issues like sugar intolerance and hypoglycemia eventually resolved too. They were able to eat a normal diet again, including foods they'd avoided for years.
It's amazing how much our beliefs can impact our physical experiences.
Totally. And all those middle-age syndrome symptoms, the cold hands and feet, fatigue, depression, irritability, they disappeared too. They surrendered the beliefs they had about aging and decline, and their stamina increased noticeably. Even smaller things like a pilonidal cyst resolved within weeks of them addressing the associated beliefs.
So they were systematically tackling each issue one by one.
Right. Their blocked eustachian tubes, which had caused them a lot of trouble when flying, took about 2 years. But they eventually cleared up completely through letting go and using visualization. And their neck pain, which had made it hard for them to dance, also started to go away as they surrendered their resistance to it. It was like their body started making its own chiropractic adjustments during movement. And their circulation improved too, which reversed the Raynaud syndrome and warmed up their hands and feet.
It's like their whole body was responding to this shift in their mindset. And what about those more superficial issues, like dandruff and athlete's foot?
Gone. They surrendered the beliefs they had about barbershops and hotel floors, and those issues cleared up. And they even had a broken foot heal super quickly around Christmas time because they applied a letting go principles instead of getting a cast. They were dancing again much sooner than expected, and later on they sprained their ankle really badly, and it healed in minutes just by instantly surrendering to the pain.
Wow. The body's ability to heal is incredible when you remove the mental and emotional blocks.
It really is.
Mhm.
And the story of their vision healing is maybe the most compelling example of all. It started with a question from an audience member who asked why, if all these other conditions had healed, they still needed glasses.
Yeah.
And that question made them realize that maybe poor eyesight was also just a belief system.
So they decided to apply the same principles to their vision.
Yeah. They immediately took off their bifocals, which had recently been upgraded to trifocals, and they just knew intuitively that their vision could heal if they had faith and trust in the process. And what followed was about 6 weeks of blurred vision.
6 weeks of blurry vision. That must have been challenging.
I can imagine. But during that time, they started to pay really close attention to how their mind was filtering their visual experience. They noticed how much of their looking wasn't really necessary. It was like they were escaping into their vision, using it to avoid feeling things.
So they were starting to see how their mental and emotional patterns were showing up in their visual experience.
Exactly. And they used the techniques they'd learned to surrender any anxiety that came up during this time. And then finally, there was this moment of complete surrender, this realization that, well, I will only see that which I am meant to see. And they let go of any attachments they had to their vision.
And what happened?
Their vision came back perfectly. Just like that. They could read street signs, see fine print, everything. And at their next driving license renewal, they had perfect vision for the first time in their adult life. No more glasses.
That's amazing. So they basically willed their vision back to perfect health.
It seems that way. And the text mentions that several other people who heard their story also experienced improvements in their vision, often within about 6 weeks. There's even a funny story about someone who healed their vision and then started wearing blank glasses just to make their spouse happy.
That's hilarious. So what's the ultimate takeaway from all of this, especially the vision healing?
It's the idea that we see with the mind, not just with the eyeballs. The text even tells a story about a woman who had been blind from birth and started to regain her vision within 2 days of hearing this physician's story and focusing on seeing with her mind.
Wow. That really challenges our conventional understanding of how vision works.
It does. And the whole account reinforces this central idea that we all have this incredible self-healing capacity within us, and it's activated through letting go of negativity and limiting beliefs.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? What are the key takeaways from this physician's remarkable journey?
Well, first and foremost, it highlights the profound connection between the mind and the body. They're not separate entities. They're intimately intertwined.
And secondly, it shows the power of letting go. Surrendering negative emotions and limiting beliefs can have a huge impact on our physical well-being.
Exactly. And lastly, it suggests that even conditions that seem purely physical might actually have deep emotional and mental roots.
So even if something seems like a purely physical problem, there might be more to the story.
Right. So this brings us to a final thought-provoking question for you, our listener. What labels or beliefs might you be holding on to about your own health, your own limitations? And what could become possible if you started to explore the power of surrender in your own life?
What could you heal? What could you achieve? It's something to really ponder. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.